So, I heard you're looking for a go-to source for entertainment.
Wait for it.
Gaming?
Wait for it.
Anime?
Plus Ultra!
Mr. Eric Almighty and Phil the Filipino? Yeah, they've got you covered. And all you gotta do is... wait for it. This is the Wait For It podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wait For It podcast. I am your co-host, Phil Barrera, aka Phil the Filipino. And joining me as always is your other co-host, Mr. Eric Almighty. And Eric, here we are, in the middle of the day. It's like the sun is out. It's disgusting. Don't like it. It's too bright outside. But we are recording this month's episode of International Feature. Very excited to have this discussion here this early afternoon. As we come off our very exciting weekend, you were able to drop into Nakama as they picked up the pieces of a messy weekend, we'll say, here in Jacksonville. And then yesterday, we went to Gainesville Infinity Con, year one for Infinity Con in Gainesville. Shout out to everybody that put that together, especially David for stepping up and helping out some of our artist friends, again, who were displaced from some of the events that happened due to the storm. We always love our convention community, and, shout out to all of you for helping bring something together out of something that was initially very ugly. So really, really happy that ended up working out the way that it did. But Eric, we are back to business here this week, and as Spooktober continues, we have a Spooktober-centric episode of International Feature. And I teased this last week when we were talking about Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Tonally, this is going to be quite the shift in terms of what happens in Tucker and Dale versus Evil and the overall lighthearted mood of that film. And tackling 28 Days Later, which I think you can say is not only it's equally cult classic and also very, very successful in terms of film and where it sits in pop culture, right? So I know this is definitely one of those instances. We're very late to the party. We're talking about an over 20-year-old movie, and we thought, you know what? With 28 years later, finally in production, after all this time, it was a great opportunity to jump into this classic when it comes to the zombie genre.
Yeah, first and foremost, just if you're new to the podcast, welcome in. I think this is a great episode to be able to join us for, because we like to highlight a lot of different international films at least once a month. And typically we'll keep these episodes pretty spoiler-free for the first portion before we dive in to spoilers, because we know not everyone may have seen this movie, although it is kind of that cult classic. And Phil, we actually learned the hard way, shout out to Corey, Patreon and friend of the show, that this is not accessible everywhere. In fact, right now you cannot stream this, you cannot rent this. 28 weeks later, the sequel by a different director is available, but not the film that we're covering today. So even if you listen to this episode, we're going to give you a little bit of an idea of what this film is about, what we like, didn't like, highlight it in that way, but it may be a minute till you get to actually watch it. So keep that in mind as you go through the episode. And again, thank you to everyone who showed us a lot of love, showed me a lot of love during our game time at Nakama, and then us at Infinity Con. We had a really, really great time. And again, shout out to Corey one more time. Normally I don't bring up Patreon this early, but I do want to shout him out because he actually gave us a copy of this film so we could actually watch it. So thank you for lending that to us. Literally, we could not do this episode without you.
Yep, and another win for the Buy Physical Media crowd, Dylan. Just gonna throw that out there.
Straight shots to Dylan. Yeah. Well,
so.
It's we really appreciate it. Also, speaking of Patreon, I ate like half a bowl of spicy ramen minutes before this.
Yeah, so you see Eric is
if it looks like I'm in pain.
Eric is redder than the 28 Days Later poster.
So don't be concerned, guys. I'm either sunburnt or eating spicy ramen in these episodes. I just don't know what's going on the last couple months.
Yeah, Eric started a mukbang channel, just so you guys know, separate from what's going on here. But yes, as Eric mentioned, if you are brand new to the podcast, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And as well as our returning listeners, thank you for your continued support here in the Spooktober month of the Wait For It podcast. November and December, as we wind down the year, we have so much cool stuff planned for you guys, a lot of fun episodes. End of the year awards is right around the corner. I am on the cusp of hitting my 50 movie mark. I am now just under, approaching 40, and I got a couple movies here in the bank getting ready to watch here over the next week or so. So that'll be a whole lot of fun. And Eric continues to add to his total as well. So it's going to make for a really, really fun award season. And as, of course, the most coveted award, the Wait For It Awards, will be given out here in just a couple of months. But folks, let's go ahead and jump into 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle. Came out in 2002. And the letterbox synopsis reads, 28 days after a killer virus was accidentally unleashed from a British research facility, a small group of London survivors are caught in a desperate struggle to protect themselves from the infected. Carried by animals and humans, the virus turns those it infects into homicidal maniacs, and it's absolutely impossible to contain. So, Eric, as I mentioned, and as we both alluded to, this movie very much lives within the cultural zeitgeist of kind of a very influential film when it comes to the zombie genre. In fact, literally every few minutes or so, we were the Leonardo DiCaprio meme saying, hey, we've seen this in The Walking Dead, or we've seen this in some other zombie-esque movie that we discussed that I can't even remember right now, but the impact that this film has had on the genre, not just zombies, but also horror in general, very apparent right out of the gate. And I want to discuss that here first, because as we are, again, 20 years late to the party to watch 20 plus years late to watch 28 Days Later, what was your knowledge of this film going into it? Because somehow you had actually watched the sequel but had not seen the original. How did that happen?
Yeah, so the 28 weeks later, and again, I have not watched this recently, so we're talking about over a decade ago. I have not watched this film. It's one of those shows that, especially if you're me and Phil's age, you saw on like TBS, USA, TNT, like some of those random channels that were just playing movies. And I think for me, it was really something that just kind of like was in that zombie era. So like I watched it. I was like, oh, this is cool. Like Dawn of the Dead-ish, 28 weeks later. Like it's not really implied that it is a sequel. In fact, that sequel movie is done by a different director. One of several reasons why it is not as acclaimed as the original. But I knew about 28 Days Later as I got older because so many people were talking about it when it came to the zombie genre, post-apocalyptic genre. And I thought it was just something that I eventually would end up watching at one point or another. And then, Phil, we are big fans of Cillian Murphy. We just saw him in Oppenheimer win an Oscar for that role. So to go back to essentially his acting roots, one of his earliest, if not his earliest role, I thought was a no-brainer, including some of the other cast members, which we knew going into this, and we also were surprised about during the film. So I think overall, it just kind of led to this moment perfectly.
Yeah, and for me, the one scene, the one photo that's always iconic is Cillian Murphy standing on the bridge, Big Ben in the background, trash everywhere. And that has been the image that has lived in my mind when it comes to 28 Days Later for as long as I can remember. And it was always a movie that I was like, I really need to check that out. This has been documented on the podcast. We're well past our zombie phase when it comes to films. In the heyday of like Zombieland and what was that? Obviously The Walking Dead. What was that terrible Brad Pitt zombie movie? World War Z. That was nothing like the original, like its source material. Like we've moved on past that, but we wouldn't have had that era if not for 28 Days Later. And with Cillian Murphy being in here, and also one of our other favorites, Brendan Gleeson, who has popped up probably more than anybody else on International Feature. We have a huge affinity for him. I want to start with the thing that probably comes up the most when watching this film, because you would ask me a question when when we got the copy of the film from Corey, you're like, how's the quality? And it's a kind of a hard question to answer because this movie is filmed in a very specific way. One of the reviews on Letterboxd says, why was this movie filmed with a pink Motorola Razr? And, that kind of explains what's going on here. Now, listen, it's not that this movie was made on a dime, but in terms of films and how much they typically cost, the budget for this movie was $8 million, right? It box officed over $80 million. Huge success. So I want to start with that, Eric. Now, we haven't gone to school for film or anything like that, but we're always a big stickler, you specifically, for cinematography. So I want to address this first. What did you feel about, or how did you feel about the way this film is shot? I mean, we're talking about a 22-year-old movie. We're very aware of that. But at the same time, some of our favorite movies are over 20 years old and look fantastic, hold up very, very well. For the aesthetic that this was going for and the era that this was trying to portray when it comes to post-apocalyptic, world's gone to shit, everything like that, did this bother you, or were you okay with the way that this is set up and filmed?
I think early on, it's hard not to look at it that way as a first-time viewer. Like, it's just very grungy. If you were to say very early 2000s, which is when this movie came out, yeah, like, you wouldn't get much of an argument there. If anything, I might have said, are you sure? Is it not, like, late 90s? So, again, when it comes to the filmography of it all, and we're not the experts on that conversation, as you mentioned, I still think that it was, I don't know, it kind of fit the tone of the movie for what they were trying to do. And it didn't bother me as the film went on. But I'd be remiss to say, like, early on, I was like, what are we watching? Like, what exactly is this going to be? This might be a rough ride. Yeah, I did feel that. But I think the movie offers a lot of other really good qualities that it's just one of those things you don't really focus on as the movie goes on.
I think in certain sets and certain portions of the film, it works very, very well. I think it works very well in terms of portraying how desolate the area is, in terms like when he's initially walking around London and, there's nobody there. I think it works very well in a specific scene where they're heading up like a stairwell or in the church, where I think it does falter. Oh, and also it's great when they're going on like a little bit later in the movie when they're in the supermarket. Or if there was one portion where the very disturbing scene with Cillian Murphy and another one of the infected. I think all that works really well. What I think it didn't work as well was towards the third act of the movie. So I'm not sure how you felt about that because, it's very dark, a little bit harder to see. There's a lot more characters as well. And I think that's where it definitely dipped a little bit in terms of quality. But yeah, like you said, you really can't expect too much from a movie that was released in this time on the budget that it was and still ended up being incredibly successful, as the scores will reveal here a little bit later today. And I have a feeling that our scores will reflect that as well. But to shift it back to the performances, everybody, I think, as far as the main four characters that what we focus on, solid. Cillian Murphy, definitely got to start there. Saw a lot of Cillian Murphy, if you catch my drift there.
We finally got to see it.
What I am alluding to, yeah, deprived of it in Oppenheimer.
You guys said we'd see it in Oppenheimer, but we saw it here, and it was glorious.
Yeah, well, that review will come in the Patreon post.
For context, it was we saw Corey at InfinityCon, again, patron and friend of the show, and one of the first things we talked about at length. So,
it's Cillian Murphy.
But at length, yeah, it was great.
Yeah. But Cillian Murphy, I mean, this was obviously very early on in terms of his career before he would go on to just deliver some outstanding performances. But he's great in this. Naomi Harris, remember at one point where I was like, is that Tia Dalma from Pirates of the Caribbean? She is outstanding. She portrays the, what's the word that I'm looking for? The survival of the fittest. I have to look out for myself character very, very well. And then, again, who isn't excited to see Brendan Gleeson in any way, shape, or form? He brings I would say, veiled positivity to the group, because he knows that he has to put on this mask for his daughter, and I think that's something that a lot of parents would do. But also whenever things, kind of take a turn, and they turn very quickly, unfortunately, for Brendan Gleeson, you kind of see that where all that pent-up frustration finally explodes to the surface, and definitely one of the more tragic characters of the film. So performance-wise, Eric, who stood out for you in terms of the group that we spent most of our time with?
Yeah, so obviously we have that warm spot for Brendan Gleeson, so gotta shout him out. I thought he was an anchor of the film, honestly. I love Naomi Harris's character initially, and we'll kind of talk about why that kind of falters a little bit towards that third act. I think you and me are going to have the same opinion from first and second act to third act with what they try to do. And again, that might get explored more deeply within the spoiler talk of this episode. But I thought Cillian Murphy was great. Like, I just think, again, for that to be one of his early roles, I thought he was a great lead for what they were asking him to do. Do I feel like that could have been fleshed out more? Yes. So I would say Brendan Gleeson was probably the most stable character for me, and the others had glimpses or very mini, like small spots of like just being able to shine. And I thought that outside of Brendan Gleeson's character, there were just moments of shining, not like consistent performances across the board. And I think some of that has to do with the way the story was structured.
Yeah, there are some very, very, I don't want to say enjoyable pieces. There are moments of joy that they do find within, obviously, a very intense situation. One of my favorite scenes, Eric, was definitely the tunnel. And I wish they had kind of built upon that tension more throughout the film. I think that was kind of a missed opportunity, but really, really solid in terms of building out that world and getting a sense of dread. And like, it really makes you think, like, we were having these discussions in terms of morality, like, what would you do in this situation, where as maybe in some films where they just kind of lean to, or some other films or TV shows in this zombie genre lean a little bit too much on that would absolutely never happen, or why the hell are they making that decision? Whenever any type of decision or any type of movement is made within this world, it seems it's very intentional. It's very thought out. It's very realistic. When you would think about, man, what would I do in that situation? Would I even be able to survive in this situation? So in terms of that, in terms of the groundedness and the grittiness of the film, I thought they very much nailed that. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There were some missed opportunities here. And I think it's always really tough whenever there are zombie films, TV shows. How do you create a threat that isn't the obvious? Like that isn't just the zombie. And when we talk about when we eventually do find that human threat, I think what you're alluding to, Eric, and I think we, like you said, we feel the same, just fell a little short. And that's what we seem to talk about a lot here on this series and in the podcast in general. It's just hard to craft a believable and well thought out villain. And I think we got that here. Where, again, another missed opportunity with building that tension and building somebody that we actually feared for. I just don't think that happened here.
Not consistently anyway, to your point. And again, I think this movie has a lot of elements that are iconic. Like, you can absolutely see it. Again, Phil mentioned at the top of the episode, we were wondering, like, is anything original anymore? Because it seemed like everything came from this movie within this genre. So there's that element of like appreciation for what it did at that time, but then like having a fresh pair of eyes in 2024 on a 2002 film, it is one of those things where it's like, the storytelling could be a little bit tighter. The character development could be a little bit stronger. And when we talk about the genre, there are things we've seen in this genre of zombie films or post-apocalyptic films that are objectively better or subjectively better, depending on your taste. So I just think that this movie had a lot going for it at the time. And looking back on it, it's still something that's worth appreciating. I would say, Phil, worth checking out. But it is something that doesn't come without the aging process of a film that like this goes through with over 20 years later, seeing it for the first time, it's just bound to happen to see those things kind of come through the cracks.
And some people, honestly, you're not going to be able to get through this. If you're a stickler for video quality, you might not be able to get through this film in terms of what it looks like. In 22-year-old movie, it was filmed very intentionally. The way that it is filmed, it is done that way intentionally. This is actually something that Corey and I discussed. Man, Corey's getting a lot of play on this episode. We actually discussed it before we had recorded this because I was asking him, hey, do you have a copy of this movie that we can borrow? So that might be a deterrent to some of you. And especially in that opening scene, Eric, I think maybe we're like, oh man, is this what it's going to look like throughout the entire film? And luckily, in some of those brighter spots, it gets a little bit easier to keep track of. But then again, a little bit later in the movie, it kind of falls apart a little bit. But you definitely recommend it if you consider yourself any type of a moderate or an average or even above average fan of the zombie genre, and you for some reason, just like us, have put 28 Days Later aside for future viewing. If you can find a copy, definitely watch it. But Eric, anything else you want to mention on the non-spoiler side before maybe we jump into some of those some of the spoiler discussion that we want to have here in this episode?
Yeah, no, I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about the sequel here momentarily, and then we'll kind of save our thoughts about the follow-up film, and we'll talk about that at the end of the episode. We'll do our rankings before spoilers, of course, but before we get to that, 28 weeks later, Phil, I kind of refreshed myself on a little bit, and I know you did not get a chance to see the film. We were thinking about including it in this episode. Really don't think it's necessary. When I remember this film, it was something that, unlike the first one, I don't recall many like iconic moments. I will say the opening scene of 28 Weeks Later is pretty alarming. If you don't want to hear...
I did watch that on YouTube.
What did you think about that? Because I wanted to ask you, maybe this is a good segue to a question I was going to ask anyway for our non-spoiler audience. What would you do in this world? Because we had a very small conversation in person. We watched this together in person, which might have been a bad idea, but it definitely enhanced our viewing experience. Phil,
it was a lot of fun.
What would you do? Because we talk all the time about this, and I don't know if this is publicly known at this point. So what would you do in this world of 28 days, weeks, etc. later?
Yeah, and the reason I watched that is because I watched another YouTube video about 28 weeks later before we started, I believe from Joe Blow Horror, who is a big horror YouTuber, and he's a very big fan of this, of 28 weeks later. I believe gave it an 8 out of 10 when at the end of the movie. But I was looking at the comments, and they were totally opposite from what he was saying. It seemed like a lot of people had, I don't want to say negative things to say, but like in terms of comparing it to 28 Days Later, a lot of people were surprised that he had enjoyed this 28 Weeks Later so much. But a lot of people kept bringing up the opening. I was like, well, I got to see if I can at least find the opening. And I did watch it on YouTube right before we had started recording. And yeah, like you said, it is alarming. And I don't think I would be able to do what that specific character did in the beginning. I mean, you're talking about sacrificing like 5 people in the span of 5 minutes. Like, that guy's kill count went like high within the first few minutes. And I was like, this is the opening of the movie. And the fact that like all the people that were mentioned, like Jeremy Renner is in this. Oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the actor, but he is in Lost, is in it. And I'm like, what the hell is happening in this movie? But
Idris Elba, isn't it?
Yeah, Idris Elba, yeah. For me, and we talked about this while we were watching the movie, it would be very difficult for me to look out for other people outside of my own. You know what I'm saying? So, like, it would be, like, if it were my sister and then my daughter and then brother-in-law. Like, if we had, like, a good thing going, very limited resources, and someone came along looking for help, like, I think it would be very difficult for me to be like, yeah, come on in. You know what I'm saying? Like, in The Walking Dead, they kept adding people to their group. Like, look how that turned out, you know? So, for me, I think a lot of people would agree with me on this, it would be very difficult. But then you posed a conundrum, like, what if this happened? So, if you want to discuss that, you know, I totally get why it would be a hard decision to make.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to, like, being a parent. So, like, if a child's involved, like, It's just such a tough thing.
You know who doesn't care was Cillian Murphy.
No, no, or the guy at the beginning of 28 Weeks Later.
Yeah. His own child. He didn't care.
No, it's yeah. So I don't know. I feel like, you got to throw morality a little bit out the window, because for something like this to happen again, it was funny, Phil, because when this movie showed 28 Days Later, we were like, oh, there we go. That's the thing. And then everything went to shit 28 days later. It's not a lot of time for civilization and morality to go out the window, right? But it's an interesting conversation, and it's always been a fun one for us. Like, I've always talked about actively going to like a Costco and just like taking it over and just like barricading it and like owning that Costco. We could probably last on dry goods for a few years and then figure out the rest later on. That's just a pipe dream. You know what I mean? Like, that's so unrealistic, but that is, that's just such an interesting conversation. And that's bringing it back to 28 Weeks Later. I thought there were interesting things like that were more explored in that sequel. Again, different director, I believe, different writing team completely. The writer for 28 Days Later, I'm not familiar with the director Danny Boyle's work, but Alex Garland, we watched the movie Civil War this year. And that's, again, kind of a tie-in there to some of the work. And you could kind of tell based off of the story where some of those similarities lie in storytelling. So 28 Weeks Later is different because while it explores some interesting themes to my memory, there was a lot of dumb stuff happening too. Like really stupid characters. Particularly one scene where like a guard should have definitely been in place to completely avoid the rest of the plot changing, but it just wasn't for the sake of plot. And then also the fact of like kids making decisions. And anytime you bring kids as like main points in these type of films, criticism's bound to happen. So there were a couple things like that just didn't really work from my recollection. But it also, again, to that point, wasn't a movie I remembered much of. This one, I feel like I'm going to remember for a long time.
Yeah, and it really didn't have that much of an uptick in budget. I mean, it did double $15 million to make 28 Weeks Later, which still, when you look at the grand scheme of things, I'm sure there were films in 2002 that were clearing $15 million. So it's probably something I will visit eventually, just because I'm going to plan on seeing 28 Years Later, which from what I hear, I think Cillian Murphy is going to be involved in that. I'm not 100% sure, but I think he has been announced to be, or at least rumored to be. But so I will watch 28 Weeks Later eventually. But yeah, from some of the things that I've seen from people that are big fans of the original, this one was a little bit of a step down for a lot of those reasons that you did mention. Would you? I'll leave it at this before we get into spoilers. Would you want to be in a more communal type setting like they do in The Walking Dead, or would you want to be more isolated, keep your pod small? What do you think? Strength in numbers, or look out for your own?
I mean, what do we learn in all, and we'll talk about like how the third act isn't nearly as strong for some of this reason, but like in these zombie stories, how often does it come back to human versus human? And they kind of touch it. One of the topics of this movie that they handle is it's just people killing people. Like 28 days before, people were killing people. 28 days later, people were killing people, etc., etc. So I mean, yeah, I'd probably go a little bit more isolated unless it was like a community I trust being led. But again, it goes back to like all the stuff we're not going to touch on this podcast, where it's like politics are involved, people's morality, intentions, things of that nature in the leaders of that area. Like, again, such a messy situation. And we don't think about that in the grand scheme of things on a day-to-day basis. But I feel like that would be all I think about on a daily basis in such a small community like that could be extinguished within minutes. Like, again, absolutely horrific to think about what that life would be. And again, when they explore those themes in these type of films, I always think it's interesting.
Yeah, Jordan and I have been playing State of Decay 2 on stream recently, and also off stream as we navigate that game. A whole lot of fun for sure. But if you haven't played that game, you add people to your community but you can also see kind of like what they're good at, what they're not good at, and if, it's kind of done by like stars. So somebody will have like 5-star fighting or 5-star shooting, or some people will have like 1-star stamina or something like that. And I will say, the people that don't have any stars, you're not getting an invite to my to my community. So you got to bring something to the table. So yeah, it would make for an interesting conversation. But yeah, it seems always to keeping your circle small seems to be the way to go. But Eric, let's talk about some of those moments, those standout moments that are spoilers. So if you have not seen the movie here, this is where I will add the obligatory get out.
Or do you want to do scores first?
Oh, we'll do scores. Okay, yeah, we can do that too. Do we
get out.
Do we do the is this better than for international feature? The more like this. Do we do
we
that?
don't do the more like this for this, but
Okay.
I do think it'll be good for us to bring up our letterboxed like rankings now that we're
Okay.
both tracking that. And at the
Sure.
end of the episode for Patreon, we will actually go over this for the first time. We have actively both put up lists on Letterboxd. So if you want to follow us both there, Phil the Filipino, Mr. Eric Almighty on Letterboxd. But Phil, yeah, let's go into just scores and how the movie was received. And we'll kind of we'll quickly do that for our audience that doesn't want to jump into the spoilers quite yet.
Yeah, so Letterboxd score for 28 Days Later, a very, very strong and solid 3.8. Rotten Tomatoes has an 87% certified fresh score, 85% audience score. So again, 28 Days Later across the board, very, very much beloved. The 28 Weeks Later Letterboxd score, I'll just throw that out here, is a 3.1. So Eric, I don't know if you want to include that in your score as well, if you have given that one. Let me see, I did not look it up for Rotten Tomatoes, but I can find it right now. 28 Weeks Later, Rotten Tomatoes is a 72% tomato meter score and a 66% audience score. So again, some of those things we just discussed in terms of the fan reception for that, very, very different. For this, Eric, interested to see if we landed the same. I gave this a 3.5. I could not quite give it a 4. I could see where you could argue a 4 in terms of where this stands in the pop culture zombie zeitgeist, because again, it seems like this is probably one of the most popular and influential films when it comes to this genre. I think as far as some of the creative choices, as well as the intentional way that it is filmed, absolutely, what is the word that I'm looking for? It increases the viability of this film, and I think that some of those choices were made for the good of the movie as far as cinematography goes. But couldn't quite give it a 4, but I do think it's up there in terms of some of the other maybe gritty, more serious zombie films that I've seen in my lifetime.
Yeah, so for me, I'm on the opposite end, same score, opposite end of the spectrum. I actually came out of the movie giving it a 3, and then after sleeping on it and getting to prepare for this episode, I bumped that up to a 3.5, really kind of evening out how I've ranked international films before on my ranking in Letterboxd, but also, again, like, while I'm more of a, it would be a 3 versus a 3.5, and it's a 3.5 but could be a 4, I think landing at a 3.5 is good because this movie, again, has so many iconic scenes. It is not much to ask for a 2-hour film. Like, again, there are not many dragging points, but even when they are, they're not very long. This movie moves around pretty quickly. I just think for me, while I enjoyed the film and I have more of an appreciation than anything else, I think that third act is where things really started to kind of fall apart for me from a story and character perspective. And we'll dive into that, of course, in spoilers here in a moment. But a 3.5, I think, is respectable. Is it more like a 3.25? Maybe. But between choosing a 3 and a 3.5 for Letterboxd scoring, I gave it that little bit of an extra boost, because if it was on, I definitely think I would be watching it. And that's a little bit better than a 3 where I would recommend it, but may not necessarily have rewatchability. I think this one has a tad bit of rewatchability after kind of mulling it over with a good night's sleep.
You also make a good point, too, because talking about just international features that we've done, I would sit down somebody a few more times, like a new person, to watch Train to Busan before this, right? Train to Busan has become one of my favorite films of all time when you were talking about the zombie genre. So I would show people that before 28 Days Later to go to kind of your scale where it's like, would you, one, sit down and watch this, but also do you want to show it to other people? And Train to Busan clears 28 Days Later by quite a bit in terms of my score. Did you give 28 Weeks Later a score while we were preparing for this episode?
I did not. I think that movie also would sit at a 3, which is also why I gave the bump up. Again, I don't remember it being like a terrible movie. So that 3 is kind of a standard score, but very much with an asterisk, because I remember moments of that film, but I don't remember it from start to finish enough to fairly grade it. So it's one I definitely would want to rewatch again. It's not on my Letterboxd scores for that reason. But Phil, let me know when you check it out. I'll probably link it up and then we'll throw it on here to give an official maybe follow-up. But 28 Days Later, again, the only one I've given an official ranking to, and I probably will rewatch 28 Weeks Later in preparation for the third film, which I hear could be a trilogy. So take that with what you will.
Yeah, and from what I understand, 28 Weeks Later very briefly toyed with the idea of bringing back those characters, but ultimately decided to go in a different direction. So yeah, we'll see what happens whenever I do finally check it out. But now, here's the obligatory get out.
Get the hell out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Okay. Get out! Get out!
As I enter in the the video here into the YouTube page. But let's jump into spoilers for this film. So, yeah, really love. We talked about the tunnel scene being great, building that tension. I thought that was excellent. I think them running up the stairs to the Brendan Gleeson reveal, also very good. You're like wondering, oh shit, is this friend or foe? I like that the daughter is following like she has her own survival instincts. Where's my dad? Where is he? Like before letting these strangers in, even though they're like yelling at her, she's like, I don't fucking know you. I'm not just gonna let you into the apartment because you're screaming at me. Like I'm safe behind this gate. So I really enjoyed that. And obviously the part of the film that's it's kind of, I think, glossed over intentionally. It's not done in a poor way or in poor taste, is when he has to go into that, what was it, like a market or something along those lines, and he kills the little boy. This is something that we also, a theme that you all, unfortunately has come up twice now, because this happened in Bruges, where there was a very graphic moment with a child.
Killing children in these international
Brendan
films,
Gleeson
dude.
is just like, yeah, get rid of him. I don't care. My friend Colin Farrell, he did it. You can do it. You can go ahead and do it, Cillian Murphy. So, man, we didn't get Cillian Murphy and Colin Farrell. Have they done work together? We should find an international film. And Brendan Gleeson. If all three of them were in it, that'd be great. Anyway, yeah, but that moment, obviously, very shocking. And there's moments where, even though we were watching this and having a good time and riffing on each other and all that stuff and riffing on the film, there are definitely those moments in there where you just kind of like have to sit back and sit in it and sit in the uncomfortable, in those uncomfortable moments. And obviously none more uncomfortable than when he has to protect himself and take out that kid, and that goes back to the morality issue. Like, you do have to, in that moment, probably save yourself for the good of your future as well as your group. So definitely one of the more, probably the most shocking moment, other than the allusion to obviously what they were going to do with the women in the camp at the end of the film.
Yeah, I think one of the standout scenes that were like shocking to both of us, because we gasped several times in this film. I mean, this film opens up with monkeys, which is Phil's worst nightmare, which is hilarious for both of us to go through. There were a lot of jump scares, but the one that maybe was the most effective is after you come to care for Brendan Gleeson's character, the bird and the blood and it getting in his eye, and the way he handles that, absolutely heartbreaking. So that was a standout scene for me. Again, a lot of things were really good to great until we get to that third act. And again, just kind of jumping ahead to it, Phil, this is where I feel like the movie just completely changes gears with its characters. So Cillian Murphy, again, hadn't killed anybody until that young boy. So for him to go like full on John Wick at the end, I didn't quite believe that. And again, we were still we were still wondering, are all of these people actually military? I don't know if they ever addressed that, or maybe I missed it, but assuming they are all military trained, that's even less believable. Naomi Harris's character almost full on turns into damsel in distress, in my opinion. And then they just drug the daughter. So any survival instincts or thoughts of her own, out the window. And I think those decisions for me in that third act just weren't very compelling or interesting. You know, it was interesting that he let the zombie loose, but then that one zombie just takes everybody out. I get the bigger picture of like, that's all it takes. But again, when you tie it into like almost the unbelievability of how we get to that third act and how that happens, I don't know. It just, none of it worked for me. And I felt like the movie kind of ends more on a whimper for me than anything else.
Yeah, it does go from a lot of very grounded moments, like, you know, right in the beginning where he meets up with the other two characters when he is saved. You know, he gets bitten, and I can't remember Naomi's character's name off the top of my head, but she immediately just takes him out because she knows that he is going to turn immediately. And then again, in the moment with Brendan Gleeson, like, they've been so careful, and his frustration gets the best of him. All of that is grounded, and those are moments that, like, you can see actually happening if you're just not being careful. You know, that's why a lot of these characters are wearing goggles, they're wearing masks, right? They're protecting themselves from any type of blood exposure.
And then
which,
they
again,
just
totally goes out the window in the third act. They just stop
doing that as the film goes, and then on top of that, Phil, I'm glad you brought that up, because again, there's like no return to that. And then we were talking about it the whole film, like, just the exposure of blood happens a lot, and like people are doing stuff like kissing and touching each other and all this other stuff, and it's like, maybe don't do those things if this thing can also infect you by like ingestion, you know, or you know, by getting into your bloodstream, whatever. But Cillian Murphy's character Jim and Naomi Harris's character Selena, I also just didn't believe the romance thing they were doing there. I felt maybe little to no chemistry between the two characters. That wasn't built upon at all. So again, that's where that damsel in distress feeling comes by the end. I didn't go for it. I didn't buy it.
She was very capable on her own.
Yeah.
You know? So now, granted, she was outnumbered. They're all outnumbered. Which in that instance, you know, you have a little bit of self, what's the word I'm looking for? Just kind of like protecting yourself, protecting the girl as well at that moment where you just have to kind of accept your fate, unfortunately, which again is very terrifying. But there were so many, like I said, we talked about, like, there's so many of those moments where it's like, yeah, I could see that happening to Cillian Murphy. Like, how did he get this body into the car? Like, how did he prop the body up? And he's like he's not even like John Wick-esque, Eric, like also like Ezio, like just moving around in the shadows
again
with a hidden blade. Like,
I just use John Wick as like an example. There's definitely better ones, but like, again, he just learns all of these skills that he had not displayed a single time in the movie's runtime up until that point. And it's like, you're just supposed to buy into that. And he's not physically intimidating either. He's this scrawny ass dude, like.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like he's not in the military or anything like that. We learned that he also lives at home, you know, with his family, and seems like he had maybe been struggling a little bit prior to the events of whatever happened, whatever led him to being in the hospital. So, yeah, it was just very startling. And again, and I think probably the point of this also, as far as the military, whatever they were, being very unorganized, is they probably weren't actually military. You know, they were just a bunch of bros that probably always had this like fantasy to hold power over people and shoot guns and do all the stuff, and now they get to do that. So, you know, I get it from that standpoint, but yeah, it just the shift in tone and decision making is so apparent and like it just happens so fast that it's like, when, how, what? Like, it's very confusing.
Yeah, and again, it some of it feels like nitpicking, but it really did kind of bring the movie down for me. And initially, that's why I gave it a 3. Like, a lot of those things were weighing heavy on me from a movie critic standpoint, right? But then I slept on it, and I was just like, yeah, in spite of those things, this movie did still accomplish quite a lot. For its time, I want to give it a little bit of grace as well. And I mean, it's just hard not to appreciate the movie overall after watching it. So that's kind of how that all turned out for me. But Phil, anything else on the spoiler side you kind of want to jump into? Otherwise, maybe we can talk a little bit about what 28 years later could offer to us, and we'll wrap this up.
No, not really anything else that I can think of. It's crazy that, there's that iconic scene where you see the roof of Brendan Gleeson's apartment, and they're trying to catch water, and somehow in London in the UK it has just stopped raining, which is just unfathomable. I don't think we've ever seen a sunny Jaguar game in London ever in the history of them going over to London. So just adding to the desperate situation that our characters find themselves in. But no, that's really all I can think of off the top of my head. Do you want to do a would you rather in terms of other zombie movies? I can switch it up here and I'll ask you, would you rather watch 28 Days Later or this zombie film? You want to do that?
Yeah, let's go for it. And then we could probably mention where it ranked in our letterbox rankings. We're going to go over our full rankings in Patreon, but yeah.
Yep. Okay. Well, let me start off with the one that I mentioned earlier, Train to Busan or 28 Days Later.
Oh, Train to Busan.
Yeah. We're on the same page of that. What about Shaun of the Dead or 28 Days Later?
I guess depending
second
on
week in a row for Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah, I guess depending on the mood, I'd probably just say Shaun of the Dead if I'm just judging it film to film.
Okay. What about the 2004 Dawn of the Dead with like Ving Rhames and Mekhi Phifer, Sarah Polley, all of them? I love that movie.
Yeah, I think it's just more fun. Like, again, if I'm going to sit down and watch it, yeah. But, I mean, that's more of a toss-up. That's the biggest toss-up out of all of them so far.
Okay. Zombieland.
Zombieland's just funny. Yeah, no. Yeah. Got to do it off of laughs alone.
Okay. Zombieland 2.
Nope. Nope, that's a negative.
Yeah,
I haven't watched Zombieland 2. I had no interest to watch it, so no.
Oh, you didn't watch Double Tap?
No.
I thought we saw that together. Huh.
No, I had no interest in seeing it.
Okay. Last one I'll throw out here, I Am Legend.
Listen, man, people sleep on I Am Legend. I also think I Am Legend has moments, and then a lot of it's dull. So I'll say 28 Days Later, although I do appreciate I Am Legend.
Yeah, I like I Am Legend too. They should have kept the original ending that a lot of people have discussed since then. Actually, I will throw out one more.
Apparently they might do anyway, because there's going to be a sequel.
I will do one more, actually. World War Z. Did you see World War Z?
Yeah, we watched that together. 28 Days Later.
Yeah, definitely 28 Days Later. Cool. All right, well, let's talk about where this ranks in terms of our letterboxed scores or letterboxd rankings for international features. I will go first, Eric. I have this right now. How many movies do you have on international feature? Because I have found that maybe some of them are, I might have a few missing. I have 23, including 28 Days Later. Is that how many you have?
I have 24, but that's because I included Blue Eye Samurai. I don't think you have.
Okay, yeah. But is Blue Eye Samurai on Letterboxd? You said it is?
Yep.
Okay, I'll add that.
Yeah, Letterboxd is weird because it has some of the shows we've watched if they're like considered miniseries. So yeah, Blue Eyed Samurai is on there.
Okay, so I have 28 Days Later, ranked 15th, behind Children of Men, but above The Raid on my list.
Yeah, so 28 Days Later is ranked 16th on my list, behind All Quiet on the Western Front and above Wolfwalkers.
Okay, there you go. So
there you go. And 28 Years Later is going to be coming up, Phil. Did you know that they're going to break that up into multiple parts?
I do now.
So yeah, that's what I meant by a potential trilogy. But I did want to go over this as we kind of wrap up the episode, Phil. Cillian Murphy is apparently going to reprise his role from 28 Days Later, but it's also going to star Aaron Taylor Johnson and Ralph Fiennes.
I did remember hearing about Aaron Taylor Johnson.
Yeah, and Ralph Fiennes, when I saw the bad guy in 28 Days Later, I was like, oh, he probably would have killed that role. So to see him coming into this one is very interesting. Also, Jodie Comer is going to be in this as well, and I feel like we know her from something. I just can't remember what it is. But
what was the name? You said Jodie what?
Jodie Comer.
Jodie Comer.
She's in something that we've watched.
Nothing that seems obvious that's sticking out right now.
Yeah, I'll look for it, but yeah, so again, just like casting wise, pretty interesting.
Yeah, it'll be I don't know about a trilogy. I don't know why you would need to stretch it out into 3 films. I mean, we know the reason why. Mr. Krabs, money. But yeah, I'll definitely be seated for that. Excited for Cillian Murphy to return, and as good as he is in 28 Days Later, he's only gotten infinitely better. So very excited to see that. Is there any type of time frame as to when that's going to be coming out? Do we know?
It says 2025. I can't imagine that's going to stick.
Yeah, there's.
So we will see.
I don't believe that. So cool. Well, Eric, anything else you want to mention while we before we wrap up this longer episode? We had obviously a lot to discuss when it came to this film and also its iterations and future iterations.
Yeah, no, I don't know if it's because of that midday energy that this episode went longer, but hey, who knows? Maybe we'll throw a couple more midday episodes in
Well, you
there,
also did spend 20 minutes of the pre-show eating ramen, so.
And I still have more Japanese snacks, so I'll definitely promote that in just a minute for Patreon if you're still here. But Phil, if you want to get us through the end of the episode, I'm excited to jump into more of that.
Yeah, guys, thanks so much for checking out this episode. If it was your first time, because maybe you met us here at one of the recent conventions that we have been at, or maybe you came across us anywhere, wherever that may be, thank you so much for joining us, as well as all you returning listeners. Just as a reminder, you'll find everything you need, Wait For It podcast related, in the Linktree link of the show notes. You'll find all the rest of our content, all other international feature episodes, as well as our future and past episodes. You can support the show a couple of different ways. One, make sure to follow us on social media, the most important ones being Instagram, TikTok, our Discord page, as well as YouTube. We also stream on Twitch every other Thursday, which has been a whole lot of fun. You can also share the podcast on social media, give us 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. All of that is a big help. Like, share, subscribe, bell icon, all those bells and whistles over on YouTube. All that is extremely helpful. But we talked a lot about our Patreon here today, as well as, some of the benefits that you get over there. And if you are interested in those, Eric will tell you a little bit more about that.
So obviously you've heard a couple people get shouted out on each and every episode. We've shouted out Corey plenty of times, so this should make up from our earlier Patreon mishap a couple months back. I think we've officially recovered from that. With that being said, Corey, Breyer, Stefan, and T3 Cato, thank you guys so much for your support over on Patreon, where additional support there helps us with the podcast, and in return, you're able to get exclusive benefits like behind-the-scenes access and early access to episodes like this one. For this episode, I basically turned that into a food review pre and post show. So I had a couple snacks with some spicy ramen. That was a nightmare. And I've got a couple more snacks to finish up the episode as we talk about things like when we go to conventions, what we thought going into the film, stuff like that. So just check us out. We appreciate it. But if not, if you're not able to go that length, the likes, the comments, the shares, the listens, the engagement, all of that is very much appreciated. With that being said, my name is Mr. Eric Almighty. That is my co-host, Phil the Filipino. And please don't forget, we release new episodes every Wednesday for the podcast, and we post bonus content on platforms like TikTok and Twitch. And all you got to do is wait for it.
So, I heard you're looking for a go-to source for entertainment. Wait for it. Gaming. Wait for it. Anime?
Plus Ultra!
Mr. Eric Almighty and Phil the Filipino? Yeah, they've got you covered. And all you gotta do is wait for it. This is the Wait For It podcast.